Impulse by Conrad Aiken. Michael Lowes hummed as he shaved, amused by the face he saw, the pallid, asymmetrical face with the right eye so much higher than the left, and its eyebrows so peculiarly arched, like a V turned upside down. Perhaps this day wouldn't be as bad as the last. In fact, he knew it wouldn't be, and that was why he hummed. This was the bi-weekly day of escape, when he would stay out for the evening and play bridge with Hurwitz, Bryant and Smith. Should he tell Dora at the breakfast table? No, better not, particularly in view of last night's row about unpaid bills, and there would be more of them probably beside his plate. The rent, the coal, the doctor who had attended to the children. Geez, what a life. Maybe it was time to do a new jump, and Dora was beginning to get restless again. But he hummed, thinking of the bridge game. Not that he liked Hurwitz or Bryant or Smith, cheap fellows really, mere pick-up acquaintances. But what could you do about making friends, when you were always hopping about from one place to another, looking for a living, and fate always against you? They were all right enough, good enough for a little escape, a little party, and Hurwitz always provided good alcohol. Dinner at the Greeks, and then to Smith's room, yes. He would wait till late in the afternoon, and then telephone to Dora, as if it had all come up suddenly. "Hello, Dora. Is that you, old girl?" "Yes, this is Michael. Smith has asked me to drop in for a hand of bridge, you know, so I'll just have a little snack in town, home by the last car, as usual. Yes. Goodbye." And it all went off perfectly, too. Dora was quiet at breakfast, but not hostile. The pile of bills was there, to be sure, but nothing was said about them. And while Dora was busy getting the kids ready for school, he managed to slip out, pretending that he thought it was later than it really was. Pretty neat, that, he hummed again as he waited for the train. "Telura lura lu. Let the bills wait, damn them. A man couldn't do everything at once, could he, when bad luck hounded him everywhere? And if he could just get a little night off now and then, a rest and change, a little diversion, what was the harm in that?" At 4:30 he rang up Dora and broke the news to her. He wouldn't be home till late. "Are you sure you'll be home at all?" she said coolly. That was Dora's idea of a joke, but if he could have foreseen. He met the others at the Greek restaurant, began with a couple of araks which warmed him, then went on to red wine, bad olives, pilaf, and other obscure foods, and considerably later they all walked along Boylston Street to Smith's room. It was a cold night, the temperature below 20, with a fine dry snow sifting the streets. But Smith's room was comfortably warm. He trotted out some gin and the Puerto Rican cigars, showed them a new snapshot of Squiggles, his Revere Beach sweetheart, and then they settled down to a nice long cosy game of bridge. It was during an intermission, when they all got up to stretch their legs and renew their drinks, that the talk started. Michael never could remember which one of them it was who had put in the first oar, about impulse. It might have been Hurwitz, who was in many ways the only intellectual one of the three, though hardly what you might call a highbrow. He had his queer curiosities, however, and the idea was just such as might occur to him. At any rate, it was he who developed the idea, and with gusto. "Sure," he said, "anybody might do it. Have you got impulses? Of course you got impulses. How many times you think, 'Suppose I do that,' and you don't do it, because you know damn well if you do it, you'll get arrested. You meet a man you despise. You want to spit in his eye. You see a girl you'd like to kiss. You want to kiss her. Or maybe just to squeeze her arm when she stands beside you in the streetcar. You know what I mean." "Do I know what you mean?" sighed Smith. "I'll tell the world. I'll tell the cockeyed world." "You would," said Bryant, "and so would I." "It would be easy," said Hurwitz, "to give in to it. You know what I mean? So simple. Temptation is too close. That girl you see is too damn good-looking. She stands too near you. You just put out your hand, it touches her arm, maybe her leg. Why worry? And you think, maybe if she don't like it, I can make believe I didn't mean it. Like these fellows that slash fur coats with razor blades, said Michael. Just impulse in the beginning, and only later a habit. Sure. And like these fellows that cut off braids of hair with scissors, they just feel like it and do it. Or stealing. Stealing, said Bryant. Sure. Why, I often feel like it. I see a nice little thing right in front of me on a counter. You know, a nice little knife or necktie or a box of candy. Quick, you put it in your pocket and then go to the other counter or the soda fountain for a drink. What would be more human? We all want things. Why not take them? Why not do them? And civilization is only skin deep. That's right. Skin deep, said Bryant. But if you were caught, by God, said Smith, opening his eyes wide. Who's talking about getting caught? Who's talking about doing it? It isn't that we do it. It's only that we want to do it. Why, Christ, there's been times when I thought to hell with everything. I'll kiss that woman if it's the last thing I do. It might be, said Bryant. Michael was astonished at this turn of the talk. He had often felt both these impulses. To know that this was a kind of universal human inclination came over him with something like relief. Of course, everybody has those feelings, he said, smiling. I have them myself. But suppose you did yield to them. Well, we don't, said Hurwitz. I know, but suppose you did. Hurwitz shrugged his fat shoulders indifferently. Oh, well, he said, it would be bad business. Jesus, yes, said Smith, shuffling the cards. Oi, said Bryant. The game was resumed. The glasses were refilled. Pipes were lit. Watches were looked at. Michael had to think of the last car from Sullivan Square at 11:50. But also he could not stop thinking of this strange idea. It was amusing. It was fascinating. Here was everyone wanting to steal toothbrushes or books, or to caress some fascinating stranger of a female in a subway train, the impulse everywhere. Why not be a Columbus of the moral world and really do it? He remembered stealing a conch shell from the drawing room of a neighbor when he was 10. It had been one of the thrills of his life. He had popped it into his sailor blouse and borne it away with perfect aplomb. When, later, suspicion had been cast upon him, he had smashed the shell in his backyard, and often, when he had been looking at Parker's collection of stamps, the early Americans. The game interrupted his recollections, and presently it was time for the usual nightcap. Bryant drove them to Park Street. Michael was a trifle tight, but not enough to be unsteady on his feet. He waved a cheery hand at Bryant and Hurwitz and began to trudge through the snow to the subway entrance. The lights on the snow were very beautiful. The Park Street church was ringing with its queer, soft quarter bells, the half-hour. Plenty of time. Plenty of time. Time enough for a visit to the drugstore and a hot chocolate. He could see the warm lights of the windows falling on the snowed sidewalk. He zigzagged across the street and entered. And at once he was seized with a conviction that his real reason for entering the drugstore was not to get a hot chocolate. Not at all. He was going to steal something. He was going to put the impulse to the test and see whether, 1, he could manage it with sufficient skill, and 2, whether theft gave him any real satisfaction. The drugstore was crowded with people who had just come from the theatre next door. They pushed 3 deep round the soda fountain and the cashier's cage. At the back of the store, in the toilet and prescription department, there were not so many, but nevertheless enough to give him a fair chance. All the clerks were busy. His hands were in the side pockets of his overcoat. They were deep, wide pockets and would serve admirably. A quick gesture over a table or counter, the object dropped in. Oddly enough, he was not in the least excited. Perhaps that was because of the gin. On the contrary, he was intensely amused, not to say delighted. He was smiling as he walked slowly along the right-hand side of the store toward the back, edging his way amongst the people, with first one shoulder forward and then the other, while with a critical and appraising eye he examined the wares piled on the counters and on the stands in the middle of the floor. There was some extremely attractive scent, sprays or atomizers, but the dangling bulbs might be troublesome. There were stacks of boxed letter paper, a basket full of clothes brushes, green hot water bottles, percolators, too large and out of the question, a tray of multicolored toothbrushes, bottles of cologne, fountain pens, and then he experienced love at first sight. There could be no question that he had found his chosen victim. He gazed fascinated at the delicious object, a deluxe safety razor set of heavy gold in a snakeskin box which was lined with red plush. It wouldn't do, however, to stare at it too long. One of the clerks might notice. He observed quickly the exact position of the box, which was close to the edge of the glass counter, and prefigured with a quite precise mental picture the gesture with which he would simultaneously close it and remove it. Forefinger at the back thumb in front, the box drawn forward and then slipped down toward the pocket. As he thought it out, the muscles in his forearm pleasurably contracted. He continued his slow progress round the store, past the prescription counter, past the candy counter, examined with some show of attention the display of cigarette lighters and blade sharpeners, and then, with a quick turn, went leisurely back to his victim. Everything was propitious. The whole section of counter was clear for the moment. There were neither customers nor clerks. He approached the counter, leaned over it as if to examine some little filigreed compacts at the back of the showcase, picking up one of them with his left hand as he did so. He was thus leaning directly over the box, and it was the simplest thing in the world to clasp it as planned between thumb and forefinger of his other hand, to shut it softly and to slide it downward to his pocket. It was over in an instant. He continued then for a moment to turn the compact case this way and that in the light, as if to see it sparkle. It sparkled very nicely. Then he put it back on the little pile of cases, turned and approached the soda fountain, just as Hurwitz had suggested. He was in the act of pressing forward in the crowd to ask for his hot chocolate when he felt a firm hand close round his elbow. He turned and looked at a man in a slouch hat and dirty raincoat, with the collar turned up. The man was smiling in a very offensive way. "I guess you thought that was pretty slick," he said in a low voice which nevertheless managed to convey the very essence of venom and hostility. "You come along with me, mister." Michael returned the smile amiably, but was a little frightened. His heart began to beat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, still smiling. "No, of course not." The man was walking toward the rear of the store and was pulling Michael along with him, keeping a paralyzingly tight grip on his elbow. Michael was beginning to be angry, but also to be horrified. He thought of wrenching his arm free, but feared it would make a scene. Better not. He permitted himself to be urged ignominiously along the shop, through a gate in the rear counter, and into a small room at the back, where a clerk was measuring a yellow liquid into a bottle. "Will you be so kind as to explain to me what this is all about?" he then said, with what frigidity of manner he could muster. But his voice shook a little. The man in the slouch hat paid no attention. He addressed the clerk instead, giving his head a quick backward jerk as he spoke. "Get the manager in here," he said. He smiled at Michael with narrowed eyes, and Michael, hating him but panic-stricken, smiled foolishly back at him. "Now look here," he said. But the manager had appeared, and the clerk, and events then happened with revolting and nauseating speed. Michael's hand was yanked violently from his pocket. The fatal snakeskin box was pulled out by the detective and identified by the manager and the clerk. They both looked at Michael with a queer expression, in which astonishment, shame and contempt were mixed with vague curiosity. "Sure that's ours," said the manager, looking slowly at Michael. "I saw him pinch it," said the detective. "What about it?" He again smiled offensively at Michael. "Anything to say?" "It was all a joke," said Michael, his face feeling very hot and flushed. "I made a kind of bet with some friends. I can prove it. I can call them up for you." The three men looked at him in silence, all three of them just faintly smiling, as if incredulously. "Sure you can," said the detective urbanely. "You can prove it in court. Now come along with me, mister." Michael was astounded at this appalling turn of events, but his brain still worked. Perhaps if he were to put it to this fellow as man to man when they got outside. As he was thinking this, he was firmly conducted through a back door into a dark alley at the rear of the store. It had stopped snowing. A cold wind was blowing, but the world which had looked so beautiful 15 minutes before had now lost its charm. They walked together down the alley in 6 inches of powdery snow, the detective holding Michael's arm with affectionate firmness. "No use calling the wagon," he said. "We'll walk. It ain't far." They walked along Tremont Street, and Michael couldn't help, even then, thinking what an extraordinary thing this was. Here were all these good people passing them, and little knowing that he, Michael Lowes, was a thief by accident, on his way to jail. It seemed so absurd as hardly to be worth speaking of. And suppose they shouldn't believe him? This notion made him shiver. But it wasn't possible. No, it wasn't possible. As soon as he had told his story and called up Hurwitz and Bryant and Smith, it would all be laughed off. Yes, laughed off. He began telling the detective about it, how they had discussed such impulses over a game of bridge. Just a friendly game, and they had joked about it, and then, just to see what would happen, he had done it. What was it that made his voice sound so insincere, so hollow? The detective neither slackened his pace nor turned his head. His business-like grimness was alarming. Michael felt that he was paying no attention at all, and moreover, it occurred to him that this kind of low-brow official might not even understand such a thing. He decided to try the sentimental. "And good Lord, man, there's my wife waiting for me." "Oh, sure, and the kids, too." "Yes, and the kids." The detective gave a quick leer over the collar of his dirty raincoat. "And no Santa Claus this year," he said. Michael saw that it was hopeless. He was wasting his time. "I can see it's no use talking to you," he said stifly. "You're so used to dealing with criminals that you think all mankind is criminal, ex post facto." "Sure." Arrived at the station and presented without decorum to the lieutenant at the desk, Michael tried again. Something in the faces of the lieutenant and the sergeant, as he told his story, made it at once apparent that there was going to be trouble. They obviously didn't believe him, not for a moment. But after consultation, they agreed to call up Bryant and Hurwitz and Smith and to make inquiries. The sergeant went off to do this, while Michael sat on a wooden bench. 15 minutes passed, during which the clock ticked and the lieutenant wrote slowly in a book, using a blotter very frequently. A clerk had been dispatched also to look up Michael's record, if any. This gentleman came back first and reported that there was nothing. The lieutenant scarcely looked up from his book and went on writing. The first serious blow then fell. The sergeant reporting said that he hadn't been able to get Smith. Of course, Michael thought, he's off somewhere with Squiggles, but had got Hurwitz and Bryant. Both of them denied that there had been any bet. They both seemed nervous as far as he could make out over the phone. They said they didn't know Lowes well, were acquaintances of his, and made it clear that they didn't want to be mixed up in anything. Hurwitz had added that he knew Lowes was hard up. At this, Michael jumped to his feet, feeling as if the blood would burst out of his face. "The damned liars!" he shouted. "The bloody liars! By God!" "Take him away," said the lieutenant, lifting his eyebrows and making a motion with his pen. Michael lay awake all night in his cell, after talking for 5 minutes with Dora on the telephone. Something in Dora's cool voice had frightened him more than anything else. And when Dora came to talk to him the next morning at 9 o'clock, his alarm proved to be well-founded. Dora was cold, detached, deliberate. She was not at all what he had hoped she might be, sympathetic and helpful. She didn't volunteer to get a lawyer, or in fact to do anything, and when she listened quietly to his story, it seemed to him that she had the appearance of a person listening to a very improbable lie. Again, as he narrated the perfectly simple episode, the discussion of impulse at the bridge game, the drinks, and the absurd tipsy desire to try a harmless little experiment, again, as when he talked to the store detective, he heard his own voice becoming hollow and insincere. It was exactly as if he knew himself to be guilty. His throat grew dry, he began to falter, to lose his thread, to use the wrong words. When he stopped speaking, finally, Dora was silent. "Well, say something," he said angrily after a moment. "Don't just stare at me. I'm not a criminal." "I'll get a lawyer for you," she answered, "but that's all I can do." "Look here, Dora. You don't mean you—" He looked at her incredulously. It wasn't possible that she really thought him a thief. And suddenly, as he looked at her, he realized how long it was since he had really known this woman. They had drifted apart. She was embittered, that was it, embittered by his non-success. All this time she had slowly been laying up a reserve of resentment. She had resented his inability to make money for the children, the little dishonesties they had had to commit in the matter of unpaid bills, the humiliations of duns, the too frequent removals from town to town. She had more than once said to him, it was true, that because of all this she had never had any friends, and she had resented, he knew, his gay little parties with Hurwitz and Bryant and Smith, implying a little that they were an extravagance which was, to say the least, inconsiderate. Perhaps they had been, but was a man to have no indulgences? "Perhaps we had better not go into that," she said. "Good Lord, you don't believe me." "I'll get the lawyer, though I don't know where the fees are to come from. Our bank account is down to $77. The rent is due a week from today. You've got some salary coming, of course, but I don't want to touch my own savings, naturally, because the children and I may need them." To be sure, perfectly just. Women and children first. Michael thought these things bitterly, but refrained from saying them. He gazed at this queer, cold little female with intense curiosity. It was simply extraordinary, simply astonishing. Here she was, 7 years his wife. He thought he knew her inside and out, every quirk of her handwriting, inflection of voice, her passion for strawberries, her ridiculous way of singing, the brown moles on her shoulder, the extreme smallness of her feet and toes, her dislike of silk underwear. Her special voice at the telephone, too, that rather chilly abruptness which had always surprised him, as if she might be a much harder woman than he thought her to be. And the queer, sinuous, cat-like rhythm with which she always combed her hair before the mirror at night, before going to bed, with her head tossing to one side and one knee advanced to touch the chest of drawers. He knew all these things, which nobody else knew, and nevertheless, now they amounted to nothing. The woman herself stood before him as opaque as a wall. "Of course," he said, "you'd better keep your own savings." His voice was dull. "And you'll, of course, look up Hurwitz and the others. They'll appear, I'm sure, and it will be the most important evidence. In fact, the evidence—" "I'll ring them up, Michael," was all she said, and with that she turned quickly on her heel and went away. Michael felt doom closing in upon him. His wits went round in circles. He was in a constant sweat. It wasn't possible that he was going to be betrayed. It wasn't possible. He assured himself of this. He walked back and forth, rubbing his hands together. He kept pulling out his watch to see what time it was. 5 minutes gone. Another 5 minutes gone. Damnation! If this lasted too long, this confounded business, he'd lose his job. If it got into the papers, he might lose it anyway. And suppose it was true that Hurwitz and Bryant had said what they said. Maybe they were afraid of losing their jobs too. Maybe that was it. Good God! This suspicion was confirmed when hours later the lawyer came to see him. He reported that Hurwitz, Bryant and Smith had all three refused flatly to be mixed up in the business. They were all afraid of the effects of the publicity. If subpoenaed, they said, they would state that they had known Lowes only a short time, had thought him a little eccentric, and knew him to be hard up. Obviously, and the little lawyer picked his teeth with the point of his pencil, they could not be summoned. It would be fatal. The judge, not unnaturally perhaps, decided that there was a perfectly clear case. There couldn't be the shadow of a doubt that this man had deliberately stolen an article from the counter of so-and-so's drugstore. The prisoner had stubbornly maintained that it was the result of a kind of bet with some friends, but these friends had refused to give testimony in his behalf. Even his wife's testimony, that he had never done such a thing before, had seemed rather half-hearted, and she had admitted, moreover, that Lowes was unsteady, and that they were always living in a state of something like poverty. Prisoner, further, had once or twice jumped his rent, and had left behind him in Somerville unpaid debts of considerable size. He was a college man, a man of exceptional education and origin, and ought to have known better. His general character might be good enough, but as against all this, here was a perfectly clear case of theft, and a perfectly clear motive. The prisoner was sentenced to 3 months in the House of Correction. By this time, Michael was in a state of complete stupor. He sat in the box and stared blankly at Dora, who sat very quietly in the second row, as if she were a stranger. She was looking back at him, with her white face turned a little to one side, as if she too had never seen him before, and were wondering what sort of people criminals might be. Human? Subhuman? She lowered her eyes after a moment, and before she had looked up again, Michael had been touched on the arm and led stumbling out of the courtroom. He thought she would of course come to say goodbye to him, but even in this he was mistaken. She left without a word, and when he did finally hear from her after a week, it was in a very brief note. "Michael," it said, "I'm sorry, but I can't bring up the children with a criminal for a father, so I'm taking proceedings for a divorce. This is the last straw. It was bad enough to have you always out of work and to have to slave night and day to keep bread in the children's mouths, but this is too much, to have disgrace into the bargain. As it is, we'll have to move right away, for the school children have sent Dolly and Mary home crying 3 times already. I'm sorry, and you know how fond I was of you at the beginning, but you've had your chance. You won't hear from me again. You've always been a good sport and generous, and I hope you'll make this occasion no exception and refrain from contesting the divorce. Goodbye, Dora." Michael held the letter in his hands, unseeing, and tears came into his eyes. He dropped his face against the sheet of notepaper and rubbed his forehead to and fro across it. Little Dolly. Little Mary. Of course, this was what life was. It was just as meaningless and ridiculous as this, a monstrous joke, a huge injustice. You couldn't trust anybody, not even your wife, not even your best friends. You went on a little lark, and they sent you to prison for it, and your friends lied about you, and your wife left you. Contest it? Should he contest the divorce? What was the use? There was the plain fact that he had been convicted for stealing. No one had believed his story of doing it in fun after a few drinks. The divorce court would be no exception. He dropped the letter to the floor and turned his heel on it, slowly and bitterly. Good riddance. Good riddance. Let them all go to hell. He would show them. He would go west when he came out. Get rich, clear his name somehow. But how? He sat down on the edge of his bed and thought of Chicago. He thought of his childhood there, the Lakeshore Drive, Winnetka, the trip to Niagara Falls with his mother. He could hear the falls now. He remembered the 4th of July on the boat, the crowded examination room at college, the time he had broken his leg in baseball when he was 14, and the stamp collection which he had lost at school. He remembered his mother always saying, "Michael, you must learn to be orderly," and the little boy who had died of scarlet fever next door, and the pink conch shell smashed in the backyard. His whole life seemed to be composed of such trivial and infinitely charming little episodes as these, and as he thought of them, affectionately and with wonder, he assured himself once more that he had really been a good man. And now had it all come to an end. It had all come foolishly to an end.